big fish right there.
All right, well, good morning, Life Center. Great to have all of you with us today. If you are brand new with us today, this is your first time here, we want to say we're so excited you chose to come and worship with us today. In fact, we prayed that you would come, that you would be here today, and hopefully you got an opportunity to stop by our first-time guest table in the back and meet some of our host team, some great people back there. They should have given you a Connect card to fill out. And then also a special gift from our family to yours, just to say that we love you guys and are grateful that you showed up here today. So if you would help us out today, take that connection card, fill that out, and then you can drop that in the bucket when you leave today. We'll have people at the back doors back here with buckets that you can drop that in for us. Our staff would love to connect with you. Also, today we have our Next Steps lunch. And so we've got multiple families today that are signed up to have lunch with us and meet our staff. And so if you're new with our church and you would like to eat some free barbecue lunch today, all right, we still have room for you. And so we would love to get to know you better, share more about our church with you. And this is going to happen directly after our service this morning at the Robertson Room in downtown Cross Plains. That's only about 3 miles from here. And so if you're going, where's that at? Well, we have maps back here at the connection point that I printed out for you that can show you how to get there. And the deal is this, you can't beat free lunch. Am I right? Come on. All right, going to be a great deal. Can't beat that. Well, if you got a Bible with you, I want you to turn with me to John chapter 21. As we're starting today, I want to give a shout out to those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, those of you who are watching on our website today. Great to have you guys with us as well. But we are in our final week of a series that we've entitled Hooked. And guys, I'm just going to be honest with y'all. I don't want this series to end. This has been one of those series, man, that I have so enjoyed. I don't know about y'all, but my dad, it was funny. This last week, you can clap. Yeah, come on. It's funny, my dad, this last week, he was kind of making fun of me because he said, hey, Spencer, the only reason I think you're doing this series is so that you can brag about all the fish that you catch. And he's probably right about that. But I'm thinking he's probably just a little bit jealous that I live in the promised land, which is Middle Tennessee. Can I get an amen? Yes. Well, guys, what we've been talking about is being hooked on the right things. And so week 1 of this series, we looked at a crazy fishing story out of Luke chapter 5, where Jesus, he took the group of these guys out and they caught such a boatload of fish that they almost sank the boat. And so when they got back to the shore, Jesus calls them out and he's like, you think that's awesome? He's like, you ain't seen nothing yet. And he says, come and follow me and I'm going to make you fishers of men. So it's this big calling. And what we've learned, in week 1 was that calling wasn't just for the first disciples. But it is a calling for all people who follow Jesus, that we are called to fish, that your life, that my life should be one big fishing trip with tons of fishing stories of life's change. And so we ended that first week with a question. And the question was this: if I'm not fishing, am I really following? If I'm not fishing, am I really following? So we're casting, right? We're casting each and every day, right? We're casting the good news of the gospel. That's our responsibility as followers of Christ. We're casting to those who don't know Christ, right? And we're reeling them in, right? We may not do the catching, but we are doing the casting. We're going and we're casting to those who are without hope. Woo, I got close back there. Kale almost got it. Almost hooked you, buddy. And so that's what God has called us to do. And the reason that we're casting, guys, is that there is another fisherman who is out there who's fishing for people as well. And we call him the caster of disaster. In week 2, we said his name is the devil, and he is constantly casting. He's constantly presenting things to people in a way that seems natural. It looks natural, but it's really not. It's just an imitation, right? It's never going to satisfy the longing that is in your life. In the end, it's just going to be this empty imitation with a painful hook that is right in the middle of it. And that's his plan for your life. You know, guys, if we're any kind of fisherman, you know that with every great fishing story, there's 4 or 5 bad stories, right? Stories where things go wrong, stories where we don't catch anything, stories where things just don't go the way we planned it to go. Guys, I remember my first time ever to take my dad's bass boat out all by myself. And I was only 17 years old. And he gave me the keys to his truck. He hooked up the boat for me. In regards to the fact that I had been with him 1,000 times and I'd watched him do all these different things, he gave me all these different instructions, right? He told me how to unload the boat, how to load the boat, all those different things. He told me to always wear my life jacket, watch out for other boulders. He told me to make sure, he's like, son, make sure you clip on the kill switch in the unlikely event that you fly out of the boat, right? And then the last thing he tells me was this. He said, here's what I want you to do, Spencer. He goes, I want to make sure you check the boat first to make sure that the plug is in the boat before you put it in the water. Well, I didn't think he needed to tell me all that. I mean, I couldn't even believe he would insult my intelligence with all those different instructions. I'm like, come on, seriously, I've seen you do this 100 times. Well, the night before, I'd asked one of my buddies to go with me, and so I went and picked my buddy up from his house. We headed out, and when we got to the lake, got the boat unloaded, man, we took off across the lake, and about a mile from the dock, my buddy looks over at me, and he says, hey, man, did you happen to put the plug in the boat? And I'm like, of course I did. If I hadn't have put the plug in the boat, there would be water shooting through that vent right now. All right? Well, here's the deal. When I slowed the boat down, all of a sudden there was water that started shooting through the vent. Okay, we're about a mile, like I said, away from the dock. So in sheer panic, I hit the gas to the boat, man. We started heading back. And what I figured out was this, was as long as the boat was moving, I could keep it afloat. The water couldn't come in the boat if I was moving. But the time that I stopped, dude, the thing would start filling up. So to make a long story short, luckily we made it back to the dock with about just ankle deep water in the boat. The problem was that we had to get the boat out of the water before it completely sank. And so I threw my buddy the keys. He went up, got the truck, backed the truck in. And while he was doing that, I jumped out of the boat with the plug in my hand, swam under the boat, tried to find the hole, put the plug in the boat. And the deal is we finally got the boat on the trailer. But listen, it was almost already sunk. I mean, everything was floating in the boat. Our ice boxes, our tackle boxes, our life jackets. I mean, the boat was full. And I could hardly pull it out of the water with my truck. I mean, we looked back at the tires on the trailer, and it looked like the tires were about to pop because the boat was so heavy. Well, after about 30 minutes of letting all the water out of the boat, all right, we finally got the boat. We put it back in the water. And the deal is this. I went to start the engine, and it wouldn't turn over. I'm like, what in the world? I mean, we worked on that thing for 45 minutes, Jimmy. It was insane. I'm like, what in the world is wrong with this thing? Finally, I was like, I give up, man. I loaded the boat back on the trailer. We called it a day. Well, about halfway home, I realized that when I had jumped out of the boat to plug the hole, I had jumped out of the boat with that kill switch on. I looked down on my belt loop, and the kill switch is on my belt loop, and literally my buddy just shook his head at me. He's like, you idiot. Well, when I got home, I walked in the door, and my dad asked me, he's like, why are you back so early? He's like, how was the trip? Listen, he knew something was wrong. And in that moment, I couldn't hardly look him in the eye. I felt such failure in that very moment. It was embarrassing. I embarrassed myself in front of my friend. I embarrassed myself in front of my dad. It was just one of those bad, bad things. Guys, have you ever had a moment like that? You know, a moment where, man, you just totally blew it. You thought you had it all figured out. You thought, man, this is going to be a cakewalk. And then you ended up sinking the boat. Well, guys, if that's you, you're going to love today's message. You're going to love it. Guys, if you remember, we started this series with a group of guys who were fishermen. And Jesus called them out for 3 years. These guys followed Jesus. Well, in John chapter 21, we find these very same guys back in their old boat. John chapter 21, verse 1, you can follow along. Here's what it says. It says, after this, Jesus appeared again to his disciples. Now let's stop right there and let's ask a question. After what? Guys, in the previous chapters, the author John has shared with his readers about the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. And Jesus shows up after the resurrection multiple times. And we know this because in this passage it says to us that he shows up again. So when we're reading the Gospel of John and we get to the end here of chapter 20, right before chapter 21, it would appear that the story is over. The resurrection has happened. Jesus has appeared to almost all of the disciples. And in verse 31, here's what he says in chapter 20. He says, these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. You know, if this would have been a movie, the music would have crescendoed and the credits would have started rolling. But then comes the post-credit scenes, all right? It's like every Marvel movie ever made. The movie is over, but it's not over, right? And so John, he just keeps going. In verse 21, or chapter 21, it seems that this chapter is just going to be some add-on. But what we see in chapter 21 is that the plot starts to thicken. To this point, there's been one character in the story who has been noticeably absent in the resurrection narrative. And his name is Peter. Y'all remember him? Y'all remember that guy? Because he's the owner of the boat in Luke chapter 5. Peter was, he was one of the primary stars of the show all throughout the Gospels. But the last real mention of this guy was when he blew it, where he failed. You know, in John chapter 13, Jesus had told the disciples that they would all forsake him when he is going to the cross. And Peter stands up in that moment and he kind of flexes his spiritual biceps. And he's like, even if all these other losers forsake you, he's like, I never will. And Jesus says, oh, really? Actually, Peter, you're going to be the worst one. You're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows tomorrow morning. And in that moment, Peter's like, pfft. He's like, whatever. There ain't no way. I mean, just a few hours later, what we see happening is we see Peter, he's hanging out with a group of teenage girls around a fire, and they ask him, they're like, hey, weren't you one of Jesus' disciples? And Peter's like, what? Who, me? He's like, no way. Never heard of the guy. 3 different times, Peter blows it. And the final time, the rooster crows in the distance. And in that moment, Peter is humiliated. he senses the full weight of his failure. He knew he'd failed Jesus. So for several chapters in the book of John, we're left kind of just hanging. What's the conclusion of this guy's story? What happens to Peter? Well, before we answer that question, I want you to think about your life for just a moment. You ever been there? You ever been where Peter is? I mean, you're bold, you're confident, you've become kind of an expert fisherman. I mean, you've hauled in the big ones. Maybe you've made some big promises. You're like, I'll never deny you, Jesus. But then you find yourself eating your words and living in embarrassment and failure. You caved. You took the bait. You fell back into that old temptation, or you fell back into that addiction. And you ended up embarrassing yourself. You end up embarrassing maybe your spouse, or you embarrassed your kids in that moment. You ever been there? Guys, when that happens, we start to believe that God's plan for our life is over. It's done. And so we take our boat and we go home. If that's you today, then John chapter 21 is just for you. It's just for you. Let's keep reading. Here's what it says. It says, after this, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. This is how the story goes. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Canaan in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two of his other disciples were together. And Simon Peter said to them, he says, I'm going fishing. So in this moment, Peter finds himself going back to his pre-life Jesus, or his pre-Jesus life. That's what happens. And he says, listen, I'm going fishing. And they said, okay, well, we're going to go with you. And so they went out on a boat all night, and they catch absolutely nothing. Peter's gone back to his old way of life. But here's the deal. It's just not the same anymore. Can you imagine seeing the things that Peter got to see while following Jesus? I mean, the dude got to walk on water. He got to experience Jesus' miracles. He saw Jesus heal people. He saw Jesus take people who are dead and bring them back to life. And now he's back in his old boat and things just aren't the same. You ever have that happen? Guys, this is the worst place to be because you've seen too much to ever be happy again in your old life, but you're too discouraged to keep going forward with God. That's where Peter's at. Verse 4 tells us this. It says, early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples didn't realize that it was Jesus. It says he called him out, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. Guys, I read that passage and that scene is hilarious to me, all right? Sometimes we totally miss the humor in the Bible because we don't put ourselves in the story. Guys, but imagine being Peter in this moment. The guy has fished all night, he's caught nothing, and there's this strange individual who's standing on the bank yelling at you in your boat. Right? First of all, Jesus knows full well that they haven't caught anything. He's Jesus, right? Yet he asks, he's like, y'all catch anything? Throwing a little salt in the wound. Secondly, he gives them fishing advice. Peter has no idea that this is Jesus. So this guy is now offering them fishing advice. He's like, hey, maybe you should cast your net on the other side of the boat. I mean, this would have been like asking a basketball team as they're walking off the court after getting throttled. Hey, how was the game? And they're saying, did you win? No, we did not win. And then you saying, well, maybe you should have tried some defense. Okay, that's what it would have been like. And they're like, well, defense, that would have been great, right? But imagine in this moment, this is Peter's face. He's like, what in the world? He has no idea that he's talking to Jesus. Quick question for you. Why would Jesus do that? Why does he ask a question that he already knows the answer to it? Guys, it's because Jesus wants Peter to be honest with himself about himself. Church, some of us need to get real with ourselves today. We do. Finding God's plan for your life starts with you being honest with yourself about yourself. It's being honest about your current condition, your current situation. Maybe the first person today that you need to quit lying to is yourself. Maybe you should say, I'm just not happy right now. My marriage is a wreck. I've got some addictions. Or I woke up today feeling dirty and hollow. I don't like where I've been. I don't like where I'm headed. Listen, so often what we do is we put on a mask. And we show up here at church and we act like everything is fine and dandy, that everything's great in our world. Yet behind the mask, we're falling apart. Listen, God wants us to get real with ourselves today. He wants us to get real with our circumstances. Well, the next thing we see is Peter going for it. I mean, he's like, all right. So he casts the net out on the other side of the boat, and lo and behold, the net is full of fish, right? Well, when that happens, guys, verse 7, here's what it tells us, all right? It says, then the disciple whom Jesus loved, all right? John's the author here. And now he's referring to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. I think that's just kind of funny. But anyway, it says, then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. Well, when Simon Peter heard that, and he heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and he threw himself in the sea. Verse 8 says, the other disciples came in the boat. So the picture here is Peter has jumped out of the boat and he has started racing the boat back to the shore. I mean, the dude must have been a really good swimmer, okay? And the Bible says they're not far from land, but about 100 yards off. Verse 9 says, when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread. And Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you've just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and he hauled the net ashore full of the large fish, 153 of them. I don't know if you see this or not, if you see what's going on here, but Peter's swimming and he's hauling in the fish that they've just caught all by himself. 153 of them. And he's doing it alone. It's like he's saying, I got this, Jesus. Look at me. I'm swimming. I'm hauling in the fish all by myself. Meanwhile, Jesus is standing on the beach with a breakfast that he's already prepared for Peter. Does Jesus really need more fish? Probably not. In verse 9, it tells us that Jesus already had fish on the fire. So Peter feels like he needs to prove himself to Jesus. Guys, he had blown it. And now he feels like he's got to make up for all of his denial. But Jesus is not asking Peter to prove anything in that moment. He's not. He doesn't even really need Peter's fish. He doesn't need any of that. He could tell the fish if he wanted to just jump out of the water and get on the fire. I mean, he's Jesus. Maybe that's how he got the fish. I don't know. But he had already prepared a table. Remember, this is not the first time that Jesus had done this whole cast your net on the other side of the boat miracle. When Jesus called Peter to follow him, he had done the same miracle. But what's interesting about it is the difference in Peter's response to the two miracles. I want y'all to check this out. Look back with me, Luke chapter 5, verse 8. All right? After Jesus and the future would-be disciples, they catch this boatload of fish. Here's what happens. It says, when Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and he said, "Go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man." Guys, in Luke chapter 5, he's wanting to get away from Jesus because of his glory. And in John chapter 21, after he saw Jesus do this again, he draws closer to Jesus. Guys, this is the starting point of the gospel. Your sin shouldn't make you fear God and run away from him. It should do the exact opposite. When you experience his mercy and his grace, you want to become closer to him. For so many of us, our Christian faith has been built on this fear of going to hell, which is only part of the equation, okay? But there's a second part of the gospel, and Peter is beginning to figure it out in this moment. He knows God loves him, but he's still trying to prove himself. Guys, I can't tell you how many times that I've been there in my life. I'll stress myself out because I need to memorize more scripture, or I need to study more, or I need to pray more, or I need to share my faith. I need to care for the poor, or I need to be a certain kind of pastor, I need to be a certain kind of father, or I need to be a certain kind of friend or a husband. Guys, for me, the Christian life at times has become a list of things in my life, a list of things for me to just feel guilty about. It's like I'm spinning all these different plates, and I thought if I drop one of those plates, God isn't going to love me. Listen, that's where so many of us are today. You are constantly feeling guilty and even overwhelmed because you feel as if you need to prove yourself somehow. You know there's grace and you know there's love in God. You've heard about it all of your life. And you want to draw close to him, but you never have really learned to just rest in him. You've never really rested in the finished work of salvation. And there really is nothing that you could do to make God love you more. And there's nothing that you could ever do or ever will do that could make God love you any less. Listen, some of us, we have just given up and we have gone back to the old way of life because we thought in that moment, it's over. I blew it. There's no going back. Guys, the gospel is that Jesus has given you his acceptance as a gift. He accepts you. The work is complete. There is absolutely nothing that you could do to make God love you more or make God love you less. Guys, what I want you to understand today is that knowing and understanding who Jesus really is will lead you to a profound sense of rest in your life. And the picture here is breakfast on the beach. Breakfast on the beach. Peter's not there yet, even though he really loves Jesus. And guys, don't misunderstand me this morning. Christians should work hard. They should, but with an entirely different understanding than Peter has in this moment. Followers of Jesus work hard not to be accepted by God, but because they've been accepted by God. Did y'all hear me? Let me say that again, if you didn't get it. Followers of Jesus work hard not to be accepted by God, but because they've already been accepted by God. We work hard to, not to earn God's approval, but because we have it, that's our only response. We don't work hard because Jesus needs to, but because we are passionate about the same things that Jesus is passionate about. Guys, verse 15 says this. It says, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Jesus says to Peter again, he says, do you love me? Yes, Jesus, you know I love you. Again, he says, feed my sheep. Jesus asks him a third time, he says, Peter, do you love me? Guys, the gospel says that when Jesus asked him that third time, Peter got frustrated. He's hurt. He begins to see this correlation between the number of times that Jesus asked him this question of whether he loved him and the number of times that he denied Jesus. 3 times. In fact, it seems like Jesus sets this whole thing up to remind Peter of his failure. He asked him the question around a fire. If you remember, Peter denied Jesus around a fire. He said, do you love me more than these? He's talking about the disciples. Peter's exact words to Jesus had been, even if all these others deny you, I won't. It's like Jesus is saying, how was your trip? How'd you do with all those promises, Peter? Guys, why would Jesus do that? Is he just being a jerk in this moment? Is he trying to embarrass Peter in front of his buddies? No, guys, it's actually the opposite. Jesus is trying to show Peter that the basis of his acceptance isn't his performance. Because Jesus, his love and his acceptance in your life is a gift based on his own finished work, not on your performance. Some of you need to hear that today. Church, Jesus had one agenda when he went to the cross. And that was to convince you that your performance is not based on anything. It is his acceptance is what we base our salvation on. And so God allows us to fail so that we can see his grace, not our ability, not our goodness. It's his grace that is the basis of our acceptance. Guys, I want you to notice, Jesus isn't saying, Peter, how are you going to make up for your failures to me? How are you going to prove yourself? Guys, it's simply, do you love me? And where will Peter learn to love Jesus? By learning to rest in Jesus' love for him. There's a pastor by the name of J.D. Greer. He says it this way. He says, the biggest enemy of the gospel is self-sufficiency. And if a lot of us were honest in here, we're eaten up by it. Some of us have built our identity on being sufficient to a task. You're like, I'm a self-made man. I'm a self-made woman. I'm always capable. I'm always prepared. I'm always pushing to be the best. But we got to be careful not to allow our self-sufficiency to keep us from really knowing and depending on God. That Jesus wants Peter to learn that. So he forces him to come face to face with his failures, so that he can tap into Jesus' love and his forgiveness. Guys, the rest of the story is this, is that Peter became the leader of the first century church. And it wasn't Peter's success that made him a great leader. It was his failures. Y'all hear me today? That connecting with you? It wasn't Peter's successes that made him such a great leader. It was his failures. Listen, and the same thing can be true for you today. Guys, what's crazy to me is that Jesus chose Peter knowing, he knew he was going to mess up. Because his failures were going to be the gateway to grace. And the same thing is true for you. Some of you, your spiritual life has always been about performance. In fact, you're here today because it's kind of a performance thing for you. You're thinking, well, maybe if I go back to church, that God's going to like me again. Or maybe if I start to give a little bit of money, all right, and I stop cussing or doing whatever, maybe He's going to love me. If I'll just, stop looking at porn every now and then, and maybe if I don't cheat on my wife anymore, maybe then He'll accept me. Guys, I want to just say, this is not how it works. God gives salvation as a free gift. And in response, you fall on your face in absolute worship and surrender. Guys, the deal Jesus is willing to make is your guilt and absolute surrender for His righteousness in your life. Guys, in this moment, you stretch out your hands, and it's one of those deals where you are in total surrender because really He's all you really need. Church, has there ever been a moment in your life where you've repented of your sin and you embrace Jesus? You can do that today. It can happen today. You may have came into this room today and you're thinking, there is no possible way, Spencer, on earth that God could love me. You have no idea what I've done. Have no idea the mistakes that I've made. You have no idea how I've turned from the things of God. And what I want you to understand today is that realization alone of understanding who you are is the starting point of your life being changed forever. It's simply saying, Jesus, I admit today, I admit I'm a sinner. I admit I've messed up and I'm in need of you. I'm going to ask right where you are, every head bowed, every eye closed today. The band's going to make their way forward. And we're going to close out. I want you to examine where you are today. Church, maybe for you, you're where Peter was. Maybe there was a moment in your life earlier on where just like Ryan and Hayden, right, and each of these guys, Parker, they gave their life to Christ at an early age. Maybe that's your story, that you remember that moment. You remember where you surrendered your life to Christ. But along the way, man, there were things, decisions that you made, failures, where you walked away from God. You went back to an old way of life. You fell into addiction. You fell into all kinds of different things. But what I want you to understand is today, that just like Jesus came to Peter, just like He was there on the beach and Peter's out in the boat and he's back in his old life, Jesus calls out to him. Hey, you caught anything? No? Throw it on the other side. And there's a miracle that takes place in that moment. Guys, the real miracle, it wasn't the fact that they just hauled in 153 fish. They hadn't caught anything all night. That's not the real miracle. Because the real miracle was in that moment. Jesus sees Peter in his sin, and he loves him. And he accepts him right where he's at. And today, he accepts you right where you're at. But he doesn't want to leave you there. He's inviting you to something bigger. Yeah, you got to admit, you got to start with the failures. You got to go back and say, okay, yes, I've blown it. But here's the deal. I receive God's mercy and I receive His grace. And out of His grace and out of His mercy, I'm going to give everything I got to God because He loves me.